So let's implement this conversation concerning how to estimate the weighted average cost of capital with an example. Okay? So um, one thing that frequently occurs is that our company does not have necessarily a beta. And don't forget that the whole process, is yes, we will need to find the weighted average cost of capital, but don't forget that in order to find, say, your cost of equity, we have to apply CAPM, right? And just reminding you, CAPM, needed several components, one of which was the, beta estimation, right? So a challenge, right? A hurdle that sometimes we have to overcome is, well, how do I get my beta, especially if I'm not a company that is publicly traded, which is very frequently the case. And what the argument is we use what's called the method of similars. Let me explain what that is. And I'm just giving you a verbal narration of what that is, but of course we'll go into the number crunching to make sure that that's clear. But just verbally. So right now, don't worry about the functions or the calculations, just the concept. If you don't have your own beta, then what you do is you go and find a list of companies that have similar assets as you do. In other words, the companies that do the same thing that you're doing in the same industry, maybe your competitors, or companies that can be identified as similar to your companies. It's never going to be exact, but the closer that's possible, then the better. And that list in an exchange. So we're trying to really borrow betas from other companies, but those other companies have to be within their same industry. Not exact, remember, they don't have to be exact, but in the same ballpark, right? Doing the same kind of activities. You get the betas for those companies, and then remember how I explained that the risk is really composed of two things: business risk, the risk of who you are, what your assets do, and financial risk, or the risk of having debt. You may recall from the previous chat that risk comes from having debt, and even if you don't have debt, risk comes from who you are. So in my example, remember I compared technology companies and utility companies. Even if they do not have any debt, the technology companies riskier just because the assets are more volatile. I also explained how, so that's that business risk component. And I also explained that even if you have two, say, utility companies, you would always feel like the utility company that has the presence of debt in its capital structure will be riskier than the one that does not, just because the presence of debt also enhances risk. So risk comes from debt and from the assets you hold. So what happens is that when you're in step number 2 and you borrow betas from similar companies, those betas will have two levels of risk, right? Two types of risk. The business risk, which is okay since you're selecting companies that are like you, right? So they should have more or less similar business risk than you have. But those betas will also have financial risk. So the risk that incorporates the presence of debt in their capital structure. And what's the problem with that? Suppose you're borrowing a beta from a company that has 40% debt in its capital structure. 40% of the money is funded through debt. And suppose you are a company that only has 10% of debt in your capital structure. So is that beta going to be really a good beta to use for your calculations? The answer is no, because you're borrowing a beta from a company that's more levered than you are. So in order to remove ourselves from that problem, what we do is we actually remove the part of the beta that is coming from the leverage of that company. So think of it this way. I take the beta from the company that has 40% debt, and I'm going to remove the part of that beta that comes from the financial risk component. It comes from having that company's having debt in its capital structure. So what's left? What's left is what we call an unlevered beta, meaning that the beta that you see after you made that removal is the beta that comes purely from business risk. Okay, so the risk of the assets that you hold. So think of it this way, right? You have a beta that has both business and financial risk. You remove the financial risk of that company, and you're left with an unlevered beta. Sometimes this unlevered beta is, frequently called asset beta because it's the risk of your assets only. Okay, once you have that asset beta in step number 3, then what are we going to do? Since we want to adapt this beta to our company, we're going to take and add our financial risks to that beta. So we remove the 40% financial risk, right, from the beta of the company that's similar to ours. Now we were left with just a pure asset beta, a beta that only shows the risk of our assets. And then we're going to plug back our risk. What is our risk? We are a company that has 10% debt instead of the 40% debt that our similar company had, right? So we're going to put back our debt so that we now have, again, a levered beta, a beta that has both asset risk and financial risk. But the financial risk this is ours. So we just remove the part that we didn't like about the beta that we're borrowing, and we put back the part that is more relevant to ours. Okay, I hope this makes sense. Okay, we're borrowing a beta, removing the financial risk of that company because it's not going to be similar to ours, and then plugging back our own financial risk. We do this for all the companies that we identify as similar companies. Okay, we do the first 3 steps for all those companies. At the end of the 3rd step, suppose you have borrowed 5 betas, you will have 5 asset betas from these 5 different companies. We average those 5 asset betas. We end up with an average asset beta from our similar companies. And that is the best reflection of what we call the risk of being who you are, of the asset risk. Once we have that average asset beta, then all we do is plug back the financial risk of our company through step number 4. Okay, let me show you what I mean, and hopefully, things will be clearer. So suppose you are a company that your company wants to find its cost of capital, but who are you? You're a company that 75% of your assets are mining assets, and 25% of your assets are construction assets. Okay. So, who are you really? You are, well, it's 75% mining, but you're also 25% construction. Let's suppose for now that your target leverage has a debt over equity ratio of 0.8, which means that effectively what this means is that the debt over debt plus equity, right? The weight of debt, in other words, right? From a WACC perspective is 44%. Okay. So this number is transformed into this mathematically to 44%. What does that mean? What does that imply about the weight of equity? If the weight of debt is 44%, then the weight of equity must be the rest, right? Which is 56%. Yeah. You have your weights. The issue is that we have no historical information. This company does not list on the exchange. So in other words, we don't have betas for this company, for our company. Okay. How do we find the WACC if we don't have the betas for our company? Okay, that's the thing. So this is a situation where you would have to use the method of similars. So let's go through this. Before we implement the calculations, I have to show you this formula, which again doesn't look very user-friendly, but it really enables us to do what I was describing before, which is how do we remove the leverage, the financial risk of a beta that we borrow from another company. And this is what this is. The equity beta is the beta you see in the markets, right? If you say, oh, the beta for Google is 1.3, that beta is the equity beta. And that equity beta contains both asset risk and financial risk. Okay. We never call it equity beta. We always call it just beta or beta, right? In some cases, but we never call it by its last name, which is, or actually the first name, which is equity beta. But it's really any beta that you see published is a beta that reflects both kinds of risk, because that's the one that you actually invest. When you invest in a company, you're bearing those 2 types of risk. Anyways, the equity beta is equal to the unlevered beta. We can also call this the asset beta, right? Unlevered or asset beta is the same thing, which is what? Is the risk that you bear just because of the kind of assets, your business risk, right? The kind of assets that you hold. It is not the risk that you bear because of the financial risk, just purely asset risk, all right? And that is going to be multiplied times 1 plus 1 minus t, this continues to be the corporate tax rate. Corporate tax rate, right? So again, if the average in Rwanda is around 30%, just say. And this is, of course, a measure of your leverage or your capital structure, right? How much debt you have in your capital structure. So what does this really mean just intuitively for now? It just means that if you have a certain amount of asset risk or business risk, the U, by the way, stands for the unlevered beta, because this is a beta that has no leverage or no debt or financial risk, right? If what you do is you start with your unlevered beta or your asset beta, and if you multiply this times 1 plus, something here, right? What does that do to the result? If you have some sort of leverage in your capital structure, in other words, if all of this term is not zero, then what that will do is that will make your equity beta bigger than your unlevered beta. And this should make sense because the equity beta includes both financial and asset risk. So the equity beta has to be equal to the unlevered beta, but times all of this, which incorporates leverage, the financial risk, into the equation. And so the overall risk is higher. Why is it higher? Well, just imagine that this will be zero, right? In other words, if this D over E, you have no debt at all, and it's zero, what would that mean? It would mean that the B sub U is multiplied times 1 plus nothing. So the equity beta is equal to the unlevered beta. In other words, you're a company that has no debt at all. For a company that has no debt at all, what is the only risk coming from? The risk is coming from purely your asset risk. But if you do have debt, then the equity beta is going to be higher than the unlevered beta. Why? Because the equity beta has both asset, right, and financial risk, while the unlevered beta only has asset risk. So it stands to reason that the equity beta should be larger than the unlevered beta or asset beta when the presence of debt is obvious, is there. Okay. So this, let me call this step 2, and you'll understand why I'm doing this in 1 second. Step 2. Let me talk about step 1. Step 2 allows you to do what? Allows you to find your equity beta based on knowing your unlevered beta or your asset beta and adjusting it to your capital structure, right? Now, let me propose the following. If you are borrowing betas from other companies, and I just told you that we have to first remove the financial risk from those betas that we're borrowing, which one do you really want to get? Which one is the one that you really want to find? Is it the equity beta or the unlevered beta? Again, let me just remind you, we're borrowing betas from other companies. So what are those betas? Are those equity betas or unlevered betas? And the answer should be, as I told you, these are equity betas. Okay, though we'd never call them that way, they're always equity betas. So you're borrowing equity betas from similar companies. And if you want to remove the financial risk from those equity betas, then what is it that you're really after? You're really after finding their unlevered beta. Okay, so the first step in everything is to first find the unlevered beta for all these similar companies, knowing what? Knowing their equity betas. So step number 1 is I really want to find this for each company. Now, how do I find the unlevered beta for each of these similar companies? Well, I use the same formula that you see there in step number 2, except that I have to rewrite it, right? I just have to solve for B sub U. So how do I find B sub U? Well, it says just grab the equity beta that you observe from publicly listed companies and just divide that equity beta by what? By 1 plus 1 minus t, right? Times d over e. So the first step that we're going to implement is borrow each beta from these companies, similar companies. For each of these companies, remove the financial risk, remove the business risk, so that you're left with unlevered betas for each. That's step number 1. average all those 3, 4, or 5 unlevered betas that you found, and to that average, you're going to apply step number 2, which is now you're going to plug back the financial risk. Now, which financial risk are you going to plug back? Your financial risk, your leverage, so that the result, the equity beta that will result in step number 2, is an equity beta that reflects 2 things about you. 1, who you are, the business risk, and 2, how much debt you have, not how much debt the other companies had. Okay? So let me crunch the numbers with you to see if all of this conversation is clarified.